Yes. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. That was amazing. I've never heard anything like that before, so that was great. It's such a delight to be here today to be talking through the work that I completed during my PhD, and it is such an honour to be receiving the Frith Prize. I still can't quite believe it, but hopefully you'll enjoy and find interesting some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So what we know is that some people are exceptional at navigating the social world. The considerate concierge rapidly reads facial expressions and anticipates every desire. The perceptive companion accurately detects the sadness behind their friend's smile. The skilled negotiator notices a telling tightness around the eyes and knows just the right time to apply pressure. However, other individuals struggle. For example, autistic people are thought to have difficulties recognizing the emotions of other people. And these difficulties predict negative social and wider health outcomes across a range of psychiatric and mental health conditions. But despite these clear individual differences in the ability to read others' emotional expressions, relatively little is known about why these individual differences exist. Nevertheless, some theories of emotion recognition illuminate potential explanations. So, for example, constructionist theories of emotion argue that there are two psychological systems involved in constructing both an experience and a perception of emotion. So the first of these is a basic mammalian system which produces variation in core affect, so levels of arousal and valence. And the second is a conceptual emotion system which houses all of the information we have acquired through previous instances where emotions have been labelled or perceived in oneself or in others. And the idea is that this conceptual emotion system allows us to attribute an emotion label to our core affect system or to the emotional signals that we see in other people. So within each person's conceptual emotion system, there will be information about the core affect typically associated with a given emotion. So that could be for anger, a negative affective state with high levels of arousal. There'll be information about the motor responses associated with that emotion. So the proprioceptive feedback I get from furrowing my brow and bunching up my fists. There'll also be visual representations of that particular emotion. So perhaps the average anger expression I picture in my mind's eye. And there'll also be information about the kind of semantic meaning or semantic definition of that emotion, which I might personally define as a strong feeling about something you dislike very much or about an unfair situation. And of course, there'll be other bits of information within this conceptual system too. So the idea is that this information in the conceptual emotion system can be combined in very diverse and flexible ways to produce an experience or a perception of emotion. So let me illustrate that to you. Imagine that I'm sensing that I'm feeling a negative affective state with high levels of arousal, and I couple that with my belief that Ariana Grande was unfairly snubbed for an Oscar for her role in Wicked. Then I might make the attribution that I myself are feeling angry. Similarly, if I were to notice that Ariana Grande's facial expression quite closely matches my visual representation of anger and couple that with the knowledge of this unfair context and situation, I might make the attribution that she is feeling angry this time. So hopefully this gives you a nice demonstration of how we can combine the information within this conceptual emotion system to make those kind of attributions. So far, the majority of the work that has focused on understanding and investigating the conceptual emotion system has focused on looking at the impact of reducing the accessibility of this conceptual emotion system. So, for example, studies have demonstrated that people with semantic dementia who naturally lack access to concepts on a broad level typically have difficulties recognizing other people's emotions. But perhaps giving more compelling evidence for this, we see that experimentally reducing the accessibility of emotion concepts via semantic satiation selectively impairs emotion recognition and temporarily too. So let me give an example of this. So we've probably all experienced semantic satiation before. This is just where you say an emotion word, or any word for that matter, so many times that it begins to lose its meaning and it just sounds like a sound. So I remember when I was younger and I became really fascinated with the word bubble, and I just kept saying it until eventually it just sounded like a weird sound and not a word anymore. So that's exactly what we do in these semantic satiation experiments. We get participants to say an emotion word so many times that it loses its meaning, and then we ask them to try to recognize various different emotional expressions. And what we see is that participants show selective difficulties recognizing the emotional expressions for the concepts that they've satiated. So if I said anger, 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 I would have a selective difficulty recognizing an angry but not happy or sad facial expression. So this has been taken as evidence for the idea that reducing the accessibility of the conceptual emotion system may impair emotion recognition performance. Now, I think this is so interesting, but something that I'm even more interested in is actually whether individual differences in the structure of that conceptual emotion system matters, whether that contributes to emotion recognition. So to explain what I mean by this, I'm going to turn to two further theories before I actually start talking about some of my research. So template matching models argue that when we encounter expressions in our day-to-day lives, we compare these to our mental visual representations or templates. And then we will read off the corresponding emotion label. So here, angry. Signal detection theory posits that signal and noise distributions that are both precise and distinct will provide high sensitivity to distinguish the signal from the noise. So if we sort of merge these two theories together, we can say that if you look at the kind of top right quadrant, this is working great, that if an individual has a really precise visual representation for anger that is distinct from that visual representation for sadness, a participant should be adept at discriminating whether that incoming expression is either angry or sad. Conversely, someone with a much more imprecise and overlapping visual representation for anger that overlaps with that for sadness will struggle to tell whether the incoming expression more strongly matches their angry or their sad template. So if we go back to that considerate concierge, perhaps this individual has built up a really precise and differentiated visual representation of a desiring expression over time, thus honing their ability to detect it in their customers. And of course, we can apply the same sort of logic to the other domains within that conceptual emotion system. So perhaps if an individual has a really precise and well-differentiated framework for categorizing their own core affect, they may then be better able to recognize the emotions of other people. But if someone has a much more imprecise and overlapping system for categorizing core affect, they may struggle to determine whether that emotional signal more closely aligns with anger or sadness. And again, we can continue applying this to these other domains. But despite some theoretical justification, no studies have yet aimed to assess whether the precision and differentiation of core affect, visual emotion representations, semantic emotion meanings, and motor responses contribute to emotion recognition performance. So in line with this, here we want to ask whether the individual differences in the structure of that conceptual emotion system matter for emotion recognition. So to answer that question, there are 7 points on the agenda today, so quite a lot to get through. So first we'll be talking about the work we've done to map the precision and differentiation of core affect, and then we'll do the same for visual emotion representations. Third, we will explore the links between core affect and visual representations, posing the question of whether the way we feel on the inside is linked to our representations for how emotions are expressed in the outside world. We will then talk about whether any of this matters for emotion recognition and build our inside-out model. And we will then develop our model further by adding these other domains and finally apply this model to autism. So in our first study, we were aiming to create tasks able to index the precision and differentiation of core affect. And so we had participants from the general population complete 2 tasks. So the first of these tasks is called our emo map paradigm, and in this task, on each trial, participants view pairs of images, each known to selectively induce either anger, happiness, or sadness across large samples of participants, and participants are required to rate how similar the emotions evoked by the images are. So if I were to do this trial, I would say these images evoke very similar emotions in me, and therefore give a high similarity rating. What we can then do is transform these similarity ratings into distance scores using multidimensional scaling and plot them. So each of these images will correspond to one of these dots in the representation. And after we've plotted these, we can then calculate the distances between those emotion clusters, which tells us how well someone can differentiate quite distinct core affect. And we can also calculate the distances within emotion clusters, which tells us how well someone can make more fine-grained distinctions between more similar core affect. In our second task, our emotional precision task, participants see the same emotionally inducing images again, but this time have to select which one makes them feel more angry, happy, or sad. And we calculate emotional precision based on the logical consistency of decision making. But what does that even mean? So here I've demonstrated a consistent emotional response. Image A makes them more happy than image B makes them more happy than image C, and so too does image A make them more happy than image C. This is all consistent. There's no ruptures in that decision hierarchy. But if the participant were to say that image A makes them more happy than image B makes them more happy than image C, but that image C makes them more happy than image A, this last decision would be incompatible and inconsistent with their previous decisions and would result in a reduction in their precision score. That's a bit of a tongue twister. So precision is requiring participants to differentiate between the intensity of emotion evoked by each of the images, and thus inconsistent decisions are likely to stem from inconsistencies in how an individual is experiencing core affect across multiple instances. So to give you a flavour of our results, what we see is that participants can be broadly classified into having these two different types of what we call internal emotional landscapes. So there are some participants, like participant A, that have these lovely modular internal emotional landscapes, wherein core affect is precise and distinct. There are others, like participant B, that have much more random and less modular structures, wherein core affect is variable and overlapping. And we validated our paradigm by demonstrating that individuals high in alexithymia, who by definition have difficulties differentiating emotional states, tend to have these internal emotional landscapes that are less modular and more random, like participant B. We further validated our paradigm by illustrating that those high in alexithymic traits typically had smaller distances both between and also within those emotion clusters, suggesting these individuals have difficulties differentiating both more distinct and more similar core affect, which again is exactly what we'd expect. So now I want to move on to talk a bit about our work mapping the precision and differentiation of visual emotion representations. So we had two samples of participants complete our expression map paradigm, which I'll talk through now. So in this paradigm, on each trial, participants view a point-like display of an angry, happy, or sad facial expression, and they are required to manipulate a dial to change the speed of that expression until it matches the speed that they think is typical for anger, happiness, or sadness. And as such, people are matching to their visual representation for that particular emotion. Crucially, we have angry, happy, and sad facial expressions, and also multiple repetitions of each expression, which allows us to index a few different things that we're interested in. So firstly, we can get an index of the mean speed attributed to each of those emotional expressions. And from that, we can then get an index of the distance between visual emotion representations by simply taking the absolute difference in the speed attributed to one emotion from the mean speed attributed to another. We can also calculate the precision in visual emotion representations by looking at the standard deviation in the speeds attributed across repetitions, and then invert that to get a measure of precision. So to give you a flavour of these results, we can see that participants again could be broadly classified into these two different types of visual representations. So there are some participants, like participant C, that have these beautifully precise and distinct visual representations, and others, like participant D, that have much more variable and overlapping representations. So now I think probably the question on everyone's lips at this point in the talk is, well, are these two domains related? So in other words, does the way that we feel on the inside link to how we expect emotions to be expressed in the outside world? Well, from our research, we think that they do. There is probably a link there. So we ran some linear mixed effects models to try to understand if there was a link between these two different domains, and we identified that distance between emotion representations was predicted by distance between emotion clusters. So those that have more differentiated core affect tended to have more differentiated visual representations too. We also identified that those that had more precise core affect tended to also have more precise visual representations. Now, I think at first glance, it's quite tempting to think we just found these relationships between our distance variables and our precision variables simply because they've been calculated maybe in similar ways and they represent precision and distance variables. What I want to emphasize here is we've actually calculated these variables very differently. So emotional precision is based on the logical consistency of decision making, while representational precision is based on the standard deviation measure. Distance between emotion clusters is based on transforming similarity ratings into distance scores, and distance between representations is based on the absolute difference in speeds attributed. So we think that these are meaningful and real relationships rather than any statistical artifacts. But also giving us more confidence in this, we can see that there's a really nice mapping between these two different domains, and this is real participant data. So there are participants like participant E that have these lovely precise and distinct core affective experiences, tend to also have these lovely precise and distinct visual representations, while there are others like participant F that have these much more variable and overlapping core affective experiences, and we see this too in their visual representations. So now I want to talk a bit about whether any of this matters for emotion recognition. So specifically, we wanted to identify whether the precision and differentiation of core affect and visual emotion representations contributed to emotion recognition performance. And so we had participants in the general population again complete all of the tasks I've talked about already, as well as an additional task, the PLF emotion recognition task. So this is a relatively simple task. On each trial, participants view a point-light display, again, of an angry, happy or sad facial expression, and they're required to make ratings as to how angry, happy and sad the expression appeared. And we calculate emotion recognition accuracy as the correct emotion rating minus the mean of the two incorrect emotion ratings. There's actually a few more manipulations in this task, but for the purpose of the talk today, I'm not going to talk more about that. So if you do want to hear more, then please do grab me tomorrow or this evening if you're coming along to the dinner. I might be quite drunk though, so. So to build our inside-out model of emotion recognition, we followed three main steps. So firstly, we selected the variables that had the highest importance for emotion recognition using a random forest analysis and the Baruta wrapper algorithm. So this is just essentially a fancy version of a permutation test that allows us to identify the variables that are the strongest contributors to emotion recognition. We then started by adding the variables with the highest mean importance scores into our structural equation model sequentially until there was no longer a significant improvement or goodness of fit dropped below a pre-specified threshold. We also then added the relationships that we'd identified previously between our precision variables and our distance variables, and this allowed us to reach our kind of first optimal model. Finally, we systematically reversed each of the path directions in that model and then compared the Bayesian information criterion scores for the original and the reversed paths. And this allowed us to identify the most mathematically plausible path directions and the most mathematically plausible model, which essentially allows us to raise some testable hypotheses in the future about directionality. So our final model could account for 61.2% of the variance in emotion recognition accuracy, and we identified two pathways to emotion recognition difficulties. So the first of these, which we helpfully call our differentiation pathway, we see that those that have more differentiated visual emotion representations tend to have more differentiated core affect, and then in turn, better emotion recognition accuracy. And interestingly, we also identified a bidirectional feedback loop between these two latter variables, such that just as having more differentiated core affect might help you to recognize other people's emotions, being able to recognize other people's emotions might help you to sort your kind of own core affect into its respective categories. Our precision pathway, we could see that those with more precise core affect tended to have more precise visual representations and in turn better emotion recognition accuracy. So what we're seeing here is that the way that we experience core affect and visualize emotion does seem to contribute to emotion recognition performance. Now, that being said, I want to throw some caution out here and say that, of course, based on these observational data, we cannot definitively determine causality or directionality. So we've just done our best to raise some testable hypotheses about these different things that in the future we hope to test via causal manipulation in intervention studies and also via some longitudinal studies if someone will give us some money to do that. So fingers crossed. So now we're about halfway through the talk today, so I'm just going to do a bit of an interim summary of what I've said so far, which quite sadly actually can be summed up in just like 2 sentences, so that's kind of wild. So what I've said so far is that the way that people feel on the inside is associated with how they expect emotions to be expressed in the outside world. So the more precise and differentiated your core affect, the more precise and differentiated your visual representations too. And then I've gone on to say that these 2 abilities or domains contribute to how well you can recognise other people's emotions. Just going to stop for some water. Cool. So now that we'd reached our first kind of inside-out model, we wanted to turn back to constructionist theories of emotion to try to think about how we could develop this model further. So we've now established that the precision and differentiation of core affect and visual emotion representations contribute to emotion recognition performance. So next we wanted to have a look at whether those with the more precise and differentiated framework for defining emotion tended to have better emotion recognition. And when we were thinking about how this might work and how it might add on to the model, we realised that there are a number of different ways in which the precision and differentiation of semantic meanings or emotion definitions could contribute to emotion recognition. So one possibility is that there's this kind of direct contribution of these factors. And I think this is quite plausible and very intuitive. So if you imagine that someone has a really precise and well-differentiated emotion dictionary or emotional lexicon, if you like, this person would then perhaps define frustration as annoyance resulting from an unfulfilled need or want, and irritation as annoyance resulting from a repeated unpleasant stimulus or event. This person is really carefully carving out the boundary between these 2 different emotions here in terms of context. And so we might expect this individual to be better able to tell when someone else is therefore feeling frustrated or irritated, presumably based on that context again. Now, if we compare this against someone that has a much less precise and differentiated emotion dictionary, who just says that frustration and irritation are both just a form of annoyance, of course this person's going to then struggle to work out when other people are frustrated, irritated, or even annoyed. So, in other words, there could be this kind of direct contribution of the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions on emotion recognition accuracy. Another possibility, which I think is also quite plausible, is that having a more precise and differentiated emotion dictionary helps you, of course, to understand when you yourself are feeling those emotions, especially because you've got unique access to that context. So I should be better able to work out if I'm frustrated or irritated with this well-defined emotion dictionary. And then there's a possibility, given that we've already found a link between the differentiation of core affect and emotion recognition, that there could be a kind of indirect effect at play here. And so we allowed both of these possibilities in our modelling. But what did we actually do in the study then? So we aim to assess whether the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions contributed to emotion recognition, and whether that be directly or indirectly. And so we had participants complete our emotional vocabulary test, which is the second last task I'm going to talk about today, so hopefully not too much more bamboozling going on, along with our other previous tasks. So in this emotional vocabulary test, participants had to define 20 different emotion terms, and how they do this is a word would come up one at a time and they would type in a response. We specifically asked the participants to give us their own definitions because we're really interested in how they personally conceptualize and define emotion. But we also made sure no one was cheating, so we forced the task into full screen mode. We could check when people crashed out of full screen mode. And we also made sure that people weren't just copy and pasting the dictionary definitions. So we searched lots of different dictionaries and made sure no one was cheating. And unfortunately, they weren't, which we were actually quite surprised about. So people actually followed our instructions. It's amazing. So now that we had our definitions, we then calculated a few different things. So first, we got the precision of emotion definitions. And we did this by scoring the definitions by 2 independent raters, like an IQ test, like the WASI. So a score of 0 was given if someone gave a completely inaccurate or incomplete definition of the emotion term. A score of 1 was given if they were sort of partially there but didn't have all of the necessary components, and a score of 2 was given if they gave a really complete and accurate definition. So a good way to illustrate this is for the emotion loneliness, some people said the feeling of being alone. This would give them 1 point because they've correctly identified the context in which you might feel loneliness, but they haven't really touched on the fact that this is normally a negative feeling, because the feeling of being alone could also be the psychological state of feeling independent, which is actually a good thing, probably. So if the participants then said the feeling of being alone that's negative, or perhaps a better way to put that, the negative feeling that you get when you're alone, then they'd get a score of 2 points. So we also calculated the distance between emotion definitions, and this is stuff that I think is even more interesting. So we fed these definitions into a natural language processor, which allowed us to compute the similarity in meaning of pairs of definitions. So how this works is it works out the meaning of the angry definition, for example, and the meaning of the fear definition, and then it will compare those two meanings and give a similarity score from 0 to 1 for that definition pair. And we then inverted these scores to get semantic distance scores just to facilitate our interpretation. So we weren't completely convinced this was all going to work properly, so we made sure that we had some sanity checks in place. So we were hoping that what we'd see is that, on average, the emotion pairs with the kind of most conceptually similar definition should obviously have the lowest semantic distance scores. Unfortunately, the pairs that we saw did have the lowest semantic distance scores were these. So anxiety and fear, depression and sadness, contentment and peaceful, contentment and happiness, and anger and irritation. So it's good to see that actually emotions that we think are very highly related are getting the lowest semantic distance scores. So that gave us a bit of reassurance this is working as we'd expect. So first we wanted to examine the possibility of a direct effect of the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions on emotion recognition. And so we ran a linear mixed effects model to look at that. And we actually found no significant direct contribution. So it wasn't the case that those that had more precise or differentiated emotion definitions tended to have better emotion recognition. At least there wasn't a direct effect there. So then we're interested in looking at whether the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions contributed to the precision and differentiation of core affect, and we did find a relationship between some of those variables. So we found that those that had more differentiated emotion definitions tended to have more differentiated core affect. So in other words, having a more well-defined emotion dictionary was helping people to sort out their own core affect. And replicating what we've talked about previously, we identified that having more differentiated core affect was linked to better emotion recognition accuracy. So this is nice because it replicates what I've already talked about. So what we're seeing here is a sort of chain of links. Having well-differentiated emotion definitions is linked to more differentiated core affect, which is also linked to a better ability to recognize other people's emotions. And so what the possibility is here is mediation. So there could be this indirect effect. So we then ran a mediation analysis to examine this possibility, and we did identify a significant indirect effect, though as you can see it's quite borderline. So we definitely need to do some replications of this in our future work. So essentially our finding is that having a more differentiated framework for defining emotion seems to be contributing to a more differentiated way of categorizing core affect and in turn better emotion recognition. So now we can go back to our model and tentatively add something else into our differentiation pathway, where we can say that having well-differentiated emotion definitions contributes to well-differentiated core affect and in turn better emotion recognition. So now that we had built our model a bit further, we wanted to turn back to constructionist theories of emotion for just one last time. So we've now established that there is this kind of role of the differentiation of emotion definitions. Now we wanted to work out whether those with more precise and differentiated motor responses tended to have better emotion recognition. And so we had participants a slightly smaller sample this time, this was right at the end of my PhD, complete our face map paradigm along with our PLF emotion recognition task. And we had participants pose in our face map paradigm angry, happy and sad facial expressions across 2 conditions. So in the first condition, participant posed anger, happiness and sadness along to a series of beeps. And apologies for this in advance. So this is a demonstration of that. So neutral on the first beep, into the expression on the second beep, awful, and then out of the expression, and then a final beep to help us cut that expression. So we also had a spoken condition in which participants said a standardized sentence in an angry, happy or sad way, and you'll be glad to hear I'm not going to put that one up. We also had 16 repetitions of each of those emotional expressions in each condition, resulting in 96 recordings per participant. To record these facial movements, we used a software called Rococo Face Capture, which uses the Face ID camera that people use to unlock their phones, their iPhones. And what this does is it projects over 30,000 infrared dots on the face, which allows people to really intricately track those facial movements. We then took these facial movements and we mapped them onto a common avatar face to control for differences in the shape and structure of the face within our participant sample, before then extracting information about the activation of 44 different facial blend shapes, which you can think to be very similar to facial action units. So these are things like brow down left, mouth smile left, mouth pucker, which is an interesting one. So now that we have our activation data, we could calculate the metrics that we're interested in. So we could calculate the precision of those motor responses. And we calculated this by taking the standard deviation of activation at each facial blend shape, at each time point, across repetitions, and then taking an average across these and then inverting the score. So this is essentially a measure of how consistent people are being in their activation across repetitions. We also had the differentiation of motor responses, which we computed as the absolute difference in activation at each facial blend shape, at each time point between expression pairs. So between anger and happiness, anger and sadness, and happiness and sadness. And then we averaged across these blend shapes and time points to get overall idea of how well differentiated angry and happy and happy and sad facial expressions were. So in terms of our results, we identified that there was a significant contribution of the precision of those spoken productions to emotion recognition, and that we saw a trend towards significance for the precision of posed productions contributing to emotion recognition accuracy. This in itself is quite interesting because in the PLF emotion recognition task, the expressions that people are seeing are actually spoken expressions. So I found that quite interesting in itself. But we didn't find any contribution of the differentiation of these spoken or posed expressions. So we're just seeing that those that have more precise motor responses tend to have better emotion recognition accuracy. So going back to our model, again, we have something else to add in here. So it seems that those with more precise motor responses tend to have better emotion recognition. So at this point where we've got, that's as far as I'm going to take that model today. Hopefully I'll continue developing it as we move forward. But I think this is a good time to think a bit about the implications of having this model. So I think there are some implications for understanding the etiology of the emotion recognition difficulties documented in a range of clinical conditions. So in various clinical conditions like depression, anxiety, psychosis, bipolar, anorexia, autism, Parkinson's, we see challenges with emotion recognition. But critically, in many of these conditions, we also see challenges in other domains. So in depression and anorexia, we see difficulties differentiating emotional states. In bipolar and psychosis, we see less consistent emotional experiences. And in autism, for example, we sometimes see difficulties visualizing or imagining stimuli, differences in the development of concepts and emotion concepts specifically, and also differences in motor control. And so it could be that differences in these other domains is then contributing to emotion recognition difficulties or differences in these clinical conditions. And so next what I wanted to do is actually test this in autism, because during my undergraduate degree I'd done some volunteering and I'd noticed that lots of the autistic adolescents I worked with tended to describe, process and experience emotion in quite a different way. And so this was a good place to start. So for the last 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk about our work applying this model to autism. But before I do this, I need to do a quick aside into the alexithymia hypothesis, which many of you may be familiar with. So alexithymia, as I've alluded to earlier, is a subclinical condition characterized by difficulties identifying, describing, and differentiating one's own emotions. And while in the general population we see that around 5% of people are affected by alexithymia, in the autistic population around 50% have co-occurring alexithymia. So this, as well as some other findings, then led to the proposition of the alexithymia hypothesis by Jeff Bird and Richard Cook. And this is the idea that autistic individuals' difficulties with emotion processing are caused by co-occurring alexithymia rather than autism itself. And when I was doing my PhD, the majority of the research support for the alexithymia hypothesis was confined to the domains of empathy and emotion recognition. So we were really interested here in sort of discerning the explanatory scope and limits of that hypothesis. So can it be applied to visual emotion representations, to motor responses, for example? And that brings me on to the sort of first research question within this area, which is very short and snappy. Not. So it's, are there differences in the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions, core affect, visual representations and facial expressions between autistic and non-autistic people after controlling for alexithymia? And then a sort of another question that comes after that, based on my theory that I just talked about, with differences in some domains leading to differences in emotion recognition, we wanted to see whether any differences in those domains contributed to differences in emotion recognition. And this then leads to a final exploratory question about whether the same mechanisms are involved in emotion recognition for autistic and non-autistic people. So to test this, we had autistic and non-autistic adults complete all of our tasks across various different studies. So now we're going to play a game of autism or alexithymia, where I tell you which of the factors that I've talked about today seem to pertain more strongly to autism and which seem to pertain to alexithymia. So first, in terms of emotion definitions, we identified that those high in alexithymic traits tended to have less precise emotion definitions. So in other words, when we were scoring people in that kind of WASI-based format for how good their definitions were, highly alexithymic people had worse definitions. And actually we could see that after controlling for alexithymia, there were no differences between the autistic and non-autistic participants on this factor. So this is somewhat of a win for the alexithymia hypothesis. It can be applied to the domain of emotion definitions. And we actually see something quite similar for core affect. So we see that those high in alexithymia tended to have smaller distances between their emotion clusters. So highly alexithymic individuals have less differentiated core affect. This is what I've already talked about today as well. And we actually identified that there were no differences again between these groups after we controlled for alexithymia. So another win for the alexithymia hypothesis. It can be applied to the core affect system. But what about visual emotion representations? Spoiler, this is not the same. So what we actually identified is that there was a significant difference between our autistic and non-autistic participants in the precision of visual representations after controlling for alexithymia. And the autistic participants actually had more precise visual representations of emotion than their non-autistic peers. And we're going to come back to this, but there was no contribution of alexithymia. So finally, in terms of emotion expression, we identified that there were significant differences in the general appearance of those facial expressions between autistic and non-autistic people, even after accounting for alexithymia. So I don't have loads of time to go through this today, but you can see some of these differences on the heat map. So you can see that the autistic participants were lowering their brow less when expressing anger. They were lowering their brow, squinting their eyes, smiling, and raising their cheeks less when expressing happiness. And for sadness, it's a bit more difficult to see, but they're protruding their jaw to a lower extent than their non-autistic peers. So anyway, this is just to say that there seem to be qualitative differences in the appearance of facial expressions which pertain to autism. But what about alexithymia? Well, we did find a role here. So when posing anger, people high in alexithymia tended to show more smiling, which is obviously characteristic more of happiness, not anger. And we also saw when posing happiness, high alexithymia was linked to more frowning and more of a downturned mouth, which is more characteristic of anger. So this raised the possibility to us that perhaps alexithymia was linked to more overlapping and ambiguous angry and happy expressions. And we then test the contribution of alexithymia to the differentiation of these, and we do find a significant contribution. And I think this is quite interesting because previously in the literature, we've seen this where researchers have attributed more overlapping angry and happy expressions to autism because they haven't measured or controlled for alexithymia. So this is a good example of why we really need to consider this in our work. So to answer that first research question of whether there are differences in the precision and differentiation of emotion definitions, core affect, visual representations, or emotion expression after controlling for alexithymia, we can say, well, in some cases. So now I want to move on to talk finally about whether or not differences in these domains, in the precision of visual emotion representations and in emotion expression, contribute to any differences in emotion recognition between groups. So you might remember that I just said that autistic participants have more precise visual representations of emotion. And previously I talked about how those with more precise visual representations tend to have better emotion recognition. So we thought actually we might expect the autistic participants to therefore have better emotion recognition. But when we tested this, we could see that there was no significant differences between our autistic and non-autistic participants on emotion recognition, and actually our Bayesian analyses provided very strong evidence for a null effect here. So this was initially quite puzzling to us. Why is it that the autistic participants have these more precise visual representations, but this is not conferring any benefit for their emotion recognition? Well, one possibility is that the autistic participants are not really using those visual representations to the same extent to help them recognise emotion. And so one way of starting to get at that is looking at the contribution of the precision of visual representations to emotion recognition in the autistic and non-autistic participants respectively. And so when we did that, firstly, in terms of the non-autistic group, it was nice to see that we replicated our previous findings. So for non-autistic people, having more precise visual representations of emotion was linked to better emotion recognition. So that's good news. But we could see that the autistic participants didn't have a relationship between these factors. So it seems that the autistic participants may not be using their visual representations, despite them being more precise, as much to help them recognise emotional expressions. Might be the case. We need to do a bit more work on that mechanistically. So we also said that the autistic and non-autistic adults produce different angry, happy and sad facial expressions. And so we thought that this might lead to the autistic participants having lower emotion recognition on our PLF emotion recognition task, because that only shows non-autistic expressions. And of course, if autistic and non-autistic expressions are different, then autistic people may struggle to recognise non-autistic expressions because they're dissimilar to their own. But we actually found that there was, again, no significant difference in emotion recognition accuracy between the groups. And when we did some more sophisticated analyses to look at whether differences between one's own production and the displayed production contributes to emotion recognition, we didn't find any contribution. So something weird's going on, basically. So after finding that these differences in these other domains didn't contribute to differences in emotion recognition and seeing some preliminary evidence for mechanistic differences, we finally wanted to systematically compare the mechanisms involved in emotion recognition for each of those groups, for autistic and non-autistic people. And I don't have loads of time to go through this, but fortunately we've already talked mostly about the non-autistic model, so you already know that as it stands. But we did find that there were different mechanisms involved in emotion recognition between these groups. So you've actually seen this, but just in a different format. So it looks quite scary because of how much there is. But essentially, those that had more differentiated emotion definitions tended to have more differentiated core affect and, in turn, better emotion recognition. Those with more precise core affect tended to have more precise visual representations and in turn better emotion recognition. And those with more precise motor responses tended to have better emotion recognition. This is all of the things we've talked about for our non-autistic participants. When we compare this to our autistic model, it is much, much more sparse. So there were only 2 factors that contributed to emotion recognition, one being the precision of those emotion definitions, so how well they scored when we scored their definitions a bit like a WASI, how well they could understand those emotion terms, and also IQ as a trait-based measure, so none of the other things that we experimentally measured. So this is really interesting for a number of reasons. So first, these findings align with recent arguments or recent sort of Bayesian accounts of autism, which suggest that autistic people may be less affected by their prior expectations than their non-autistic peers. And it also aligns with more recent arguments that autistic people may adopt an alternative, perhaps cognitively mediated strategy to recognise the emotions of other people, especially given that both of the variables that seem to contribute are very cognitive in nature. So having a good understanding of emotion terms is quite cognitive, along with, of course, IQ. But of course, as you can see, a lot more work needs to be done to try and understand the mechanisms that are involved in emotion recognition for autistic people, and also to replicate our findings and start picking apart directionality and causality. So we are actually going to be able to start doing this thanks to an EPS small grant, so thanks so much to EPS. So watch this space for some updates and hopefully a bit more clarity on what's going on. So finally, just to conclude, what I've said today is that within the general public, the structure of the conceptual emotion system matters for emotion recognition, and that within this group, the conceptualization, experience, visualization, expression, and recognition of emotion are all linked. And I put forth some tentative evidence that there might be some differences in the psychological mechanisms involved in autistic and non-autistic emotion recognition. So finally, before I say thanks to lots of amazing people I'm lucky to work with, I want to point to some shared materials. So lots of the tasks I've talked about today have been shared online on Gorilla. You can just go there right away and clone them and use them in your own work if anyone's interested, or just having a go with them if you'd like. I've also shared some data processing and analysis scripts to help with that. We're also developing new versions of these tasks at the moment where we include all 6 basic emotions and full dynamic emotional expressions to go into that kind of next EPS small grant project to really try and pick this apart with a different kind of stimuli and replicate and extend our model. So email me if you're more interested in those tasks that seem a bit more developed, I guess. Finally, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to everyone that's made this work possible. First and foremost, I want to say a huge thank you to Jennifer Cook, who's my first PhD supervisor, my primary supervisor. I had like the best time working with Jen on all of these things. It was such an inspirational and nourishing experience, or nurturing, not nourishing, I think. Not sure what that's about. Nurturing experience. And I feel really grateful for all of her support, and I think I wouldn't be here today having completed my PhD and stuff without her. So I'm super grateful for that. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to the Cook Lab for all of their support, to my second supervisor, Sophie Sowden-Carvalho, to all the lived experience experts who helped us make our studies autism friendly, and finally to the participants. And last but not least, I want to say a huge thank you to the EPS for the opportunity to speak today and for the award, and to all of you for listening. So yeah, thank you.